which just released, and this is amazing, a third edition. So Sheila, I've written a bunch of books that barely made it out of the first edition. So the fact that this is a third edition book, I just want to say to our podcast listeners, that means this is a book that has, it stood the test of time. It continues to be relevant. The topic will always be relevant. The life cycle of this book will just go on and on and on. She's also written, Thanks for the Feedback, The Science and Art of Receiving Feedback Well. So Sheila, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Well, I'm honored to have been invited. And yeah, we have a lot to talk about, right?
Yes. As I was saying before we hit record, I have so many questions personally. I'll try not to turn this into a counseling session. So
we're happy to jump into a counseling session, right? Because we'll all identify.
Yeah. Well, nobody listening is a stranger to difficult conversations, and we know what they are, so we don't have to define them. They happen at home, at work, in our neighborhoods, and most of us, and tell me if you think I'm wrong about this, but I think most of us think we're pretty good at difficult conversations. Even the people who have a tendency to avoid them, I think on the back end, it's like, I handled that pretty well. But after reading your book, we are not. And we're not because of the way that you describe what's actually going on in difficult conversations. We're very one-dimensional, as we're about to see, and this is where your work was so helpful to me. So as we head into this season of difficult conversations, we're in December. We have potentially difficult conversations at work. People think they're going to get a bonus, and they're not, or it's not what they thought. We're closing things, not going to crank them back up at the first of the year. And then there's the whole holiday thing, right? Difficult conversations during the holidays. So to get to the questions, what is at the core of being good at having difficult conversations?
Oh, boy. I mean, one of the things that you just hit on that sparked something for me was really the way that the conversations feel to us in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And what's been interesting to me over the last few decades is just noticing for myself the conversations that don't feel quite as challenging or that go pretty well. It just feels like, well, yeah, because, I'm good and they're a great person and totally reasonable, right? So then when we bump into something where either it doesn't go well or we're anticipating how badly it's going to go, based on history between us, maybe, then it just feels like, well, the problem obviously isn't me. The problem's the other person.
Yep.
Because they're just so difficult.
Yep.
And so for me, part of this journey has been about better understanding what's going on with me in those moments and where I'm getting myself stuck.
Yep.
And I think that at the heart of it is that to understand our own difficult conversations, we have to look beyond what to say or what we do say to each other and look at what each of us is really thinking and feeling and sometimes not saying to the other, because that's what gives us a kind of x-ray into the difficulty.
Yep. And you do a deep dive into this. In fact, it's sort of the theme of the book because you talk about the fact that there's three layers of really any conversation, not just difficult ones, every conversation.
Totally.
But with difficult conversations, these three layers become more important than ever. So can you talk a little bit about these three layers? I think we're all aware of one of them for sure, but it's those other two that leave us walking away thinking, wow, why is that so confusing? It was so clear to me. So unpack this.
Yeah, so this was a real revelation, which is that in any conversation, and especially in difficult conversations when we're in conflict with someone, there are really three layers of things going on and three buckets of things that our internal voice is preoccupied with. And the first is the most obvious, as you mentioned, which is what we call the what happened conversation. In other words, each of us has a story about what has happened, what is happening now as we're trying to have a conversation about it, and what we think should happen in the future. And that story itself really has three key pieces to it. One is who's right, and in particular, of course, what I'm right about. The second second is, whose fault is it that we're having this problem? And the third is, well, what's motivating you? What are your intentions? Why are you acting this way? And what's interesting is that when you talk with people about their toughest conversations, the intentions piece is often the piece that leads the story. In other words, they'll say, I'm stressed out because I have to have this conversation with my boss or a difficult colleague. And let me just tell you the kind of person they are, because then now that you understand that they love to be in control or they always want to be right, which is my read on their intentions, motivations, or character, that helps you understand why I'm right and why it's their fault.
Yep.
And so that story is going on for me, but by the way, it's also going on for the other person. And that's just the first layer of our stories and how they differ in terms of what's happening. Yeah,
so it's what's happening and or what just happened, and now we're going to unpack it. And I think as I read the book, I realized, I think I may be overstating this. I think for most of us, that's as far as we get. The conversation is focused on, here's what happened. Why did you do that? That's not what I did. Well, that's what I think you did. Well, that's what I heard you did. And we just stay there. And again, every parent listening, it's just, I don't have time to talk about this, honey. Why did you do that, son? We just get stuck there.
What were you thinking?
But it's these next, what were you thinking? And they're 18 years old and they're not thinking yet. And we realize, frontal lobe development.
What were you thinking?
Yes, frontal lobe development is a thing, right? Okay, so moving beyond the what happened and why did you do it and what were your intentions and all of that. The second one, this is where it gets so interesting and so helpful. You talk about the feelings conversation. And again, these are all simultaneous. Talk a little bit about that layer.
Yeah, so sitting under our story about what happened and what should happen is this question of, what do I do with the feelings involved? And by the time something becomes a difficult conversation, one and often both parties have a whole bundle of feelings. We think of them in singles, like I'm frustrated or I'm feeling anxious. But in fact, in a difficult conversation, I've often got a whole bundle of sometimes conflicting feelings. Like, I really do appreciate all that you've done for us this year. And the fact that nothing has changed on this one front is driving me crazy. And I'm really frustrated with you. And I'm anxious about having the conversation with you because I also don't want to demotivate you. So I'm also feeling some trepidation and some self-doubt about whether we're going to get through this. So I'm trying to manage all of those feelings. And sometimes when we're preoccupied with our own emotions, we're not also thinking about, well, you're walking in the door into a conversation that you probably have a bunch of strong feelings about too.
Yep.
So the second layer is all about, what do we do with the strong feelings that we have? Because often we think, well, I'll just keep that touchy-feely stuff, and feelings, the messy feelings out of it. And the problem with that is that by the time something becomes a difficult conversation, usually we're trying to solve two problems at least. One is the surface problem, like, do you get a bonus or not? And how do we talk about that? But there's often a second layer underneath it of how we each feel treated by the other, both in the conversation itself and in our bigger working relationship. So how do we talk about that? And if we ignore it, then the feelings are just driving the energy of the conversation rather than being addressed more explicitly.
And they do drive the energy of the conversation. There's no doubt about it. Sometimes off a cliff. About, 30 years ago, and I took a class. It wasn't like for credit class, but sort of a seminar on empathetic listening. And this does not come natural to me, but I'm telling you, this was one of the greatest skills I have tried to develop, and it especially came in helpful as a parent. And empathetic listening, you know far more about it than I do, is basically when you listen not just to the words, but to the emotions and identify emotions. And goodness, when I am smart enough to bring the other person's emotions or name those for them and mine, something almost magical can happen in a conversation. I think because when people identify mine, I feel heard, right? Because we're talking about the stuff that happened, but when somebody dips into how this has made me feel, or I can acknowledge how I'm sure this is making them feel, it kind of at least opens the door to this second layer you're talking about. Is that correct?
I think that is correct. And one of the exercises that we sometimes do in our exec ed courses is a question about what are you listening for? So we'll do it in triads, because we're called triad. And so the talker is invited to talk about a situation that they feel they did not handle well. And one of the listeners is assigned to listen for facts or what happened. And the other person is assigned to just listen for feelings.
Oh, wow.
And it's not particularly structured. I'm like, you're going to have 6 or 7 minutes and, you can jump in. You're naturally going to ask different follow-up questions.
Yep.
And so we kind of get beyond the initial question of, am I listening well or poorly? And the next level of listening is really, what are you listening for? And listening for feelings will take you in a totally different direction in a conversation. In a really beautiful way. And part of what good listeners do is that they're very deft at moving between and meeting their talker wherever they're at. I mean, it's an interesting thing to do at the dinner table, right? When a kid comes home and is frustrated about something at school or sports practice or whatever. And if you each tag team to be like, all right, I'm on feelings, you be on what happened.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
You actually can have a more complete conversation.
Yep.
About what that was like for them and whether and how they want any help thinking about what to do about it.
And our natural tendency, and you talk a good deal about this in the book, in terms of a business context, our natural tendency is what happened. I mean, even as a parent, if your son or daughter comes home and they say, I hate my teacher, the first thing out of my mouth is, well, what happened? Well, they've just expressed an emotion. I hate my teacher. Right. And I've already changed the subject. I've not gotten on board with the hate. I've just gone to the what happened. And it's a skill. And I think, that some people are so good at this. And others of us have to discipline ourselves to listen for those emotions and affirm every emotion should be affirmed because it's just the way people feel.
Yeah.
But it is not natural. Now, talk a little bit about that in the marketplace culture because, there's a tendency to go, oh, no, we don't do that. We're all business. We just need to keep it facts. We don't need to dip into that layer or that level. But that's a mistake. Talk a little bit about why that's the case.
Well, I think it's because if the problem we're trying to solve is really a feelings problem, we're not going to solve the right problem if we're ignoring the feelings.
Yep.
And what do I mean by a feelings problem? Well, first of all, my colleague comes in and they're incredibly frustrated about the interaction they just had with the client, right? Well, I can jump into problem solving, but they may not be there yet. And what they want is just for me to go like, oh my gosh, that must have been so tough because you talked to me because you were looking forward to this call. So that must have been a surprise. And I'm really just listening for what's going on between you and the client and what was it like to step into what you thought was going to be an easy conversation and suddenly was difficult. They're going to feel like, oh, you and I just connected and now I'm more open, right? I'm more open to any suggestions you have or are there ways I can help, et cetera. Also, what I watch happen all the time is leadership teams talking about how do we improve engagement? How do we improve morale? How do we improve retention? Those are all feelings problems.
Yep.
About whether people feel seen,
appreciated,
whether they feel affiliated and included, whether they feel listened to about the things that they feel they are legitimate, that they have to say and think should change. how they feel treated is what's going to drive each of those scores.
Yep.
Right. And if we're just in problem solving mode, well, let's have more Employee of the Month recognition.
Right.
The recognition, if it's genuine, may meet the appreciation need, but we're just focusing on the wrong part of the problem.
And again, I think some people are skilled at this and others aren't. And the exercise you mentioned a few minutes ago, where you have one person assigned to one and one the other, that's a pretty fascinating idea, especially where there are two people who have an opportunity to listen and listen specifically for those two things. So anyway, there's so much I would like to talk about that, because the whole being willing to be transparent about my own, but to affirm the other person's, it really is, you feel known. And when a person feels known, they're just going to trust, and the conversation isn't as difficult, even, when it's contentious and there really are difficult things to talk about. Now, this third one is, for me, this was like a door opened up, because I empathetic listening, I knew a bit about that, but this identity piece is so extraordinarily powerful and challenging to me as I think about conversations that didn't go well, where I basically ignored the identity factor. So I think this is the most challenging one to understand. So talk a little bit about the identity conversation.
Yeah. So this was a revelation for me too, to be honest, and continues to surprise me, where I'm like, oh, right. That's what's going on for me right now. So the idea here is that we all have stories we tell about who we are and who we want to be. And often, if a conversation feels difficult, chances are there's something the situation suggests about you that feels like it's at stake. Mm-hmm. So the identity conversation is the conversation with myself about myself. In other words, have I let someone down? Am I going to disappoint someone? Are they going to be mad at me? Do I not know what I'm doing? Am I competent? 3 core identity pieces are: am I competent or incompetent, respected or not respected? Maybe goes along with that. Am I a good person? And am I worthy? Am I worthy of love? Am I worthy of being here, etc.? You can have every variation in the world if you just ask the question, what does the situation suggest about me that feels like it's at stake? If you have trouble saying no, often it's rooted in an identity that you think of yourself as a team player, as someone who's very loyal or never abandoned someone in need. And if that's true, anytime anybody asks you for help, it's hard to say no. So we've described, and by the way, identity these days includes the things that we think of as socioeconomic or political or racial or ethnic, right? It includes all of those things, but and sometimes that gets implicated because it's like, am I betraying a group that I usually feel affiliated with? And do I feel like I'm not in agreement with them in this particular case, or I've let them down?
But for this, to leverage this, tell me if I'm wrong, I need to be as attuned as I can be to how I think they carry their identity, correct? Because
both. The first place to start is with yourself.
To make sure I'm not communicating through some sort of defensive posture about my own identity, you mean?
Yes, and also chances are you have contributed to the problem.
Always. Are you talking about me personally? Yes, always.
Yes. Yeah, I've talked to some of your colleagues and family.
No, I know, yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's, for me, the hardest thing of like, oh, I am part of the problem. That is so disappointing.
Yeah.
And that's an identity thing for me too. Like, I knew better and I really let this person down. And I also think that in Christian communities and nonprofits, mission-driven, it's like, am I a good person? I let myself down in terms of who I want to be in the world. Mm-hmm. So the first is to just get a handle on your own and just to ground yourself in accepting what is true, which is, as a human, you can never live up to the standards we set for ourselves. You can strive toward them, and then you can take responsibility when we inevitably fall short. And identity is complicated because I would want to be responsive to clients, but I also want to be a good parent. And when I'm with one of my kids and my phone rings, I have to make a choice. Life is complicated.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, that if I can ground myself, then I also can think about, gosh, what does this suggest about them that feels like it may be at issue? And can I be aware of that and not inadvertently make that worse?
Yeah. So where I've tried to apply this is, especially within, I mean, it's a little bit easier at home because the roles and how we identify in our homes is pretty much set. But with so many different employees and different personalities at work, when I can remember, and I have a couple illustrations, I don't know if you want to go into that,
Yeah,
but
please.
when I can remember to the best of my ability how I think this person identifies themselves in terms of what they feel like they're good at, what they feel like they've been successful at, which does, these are all just things that happen whether they're healthy or not. If I can be careful not to attack those things or to affirm those things before I talk about the difficult part, I've found that I'm able to separate out, and I've already set a tone to say, I'm not attacking the you part. We're really talking about an issue of performance. And the flip side is when we're aware of how a person identifies, our compliments can be richer and deeper as well, because those positives make a bigger impact when we affirm their kind of sense of self-identity. Anyway, so this is a really big, rich topic that I think has more to do with the unresolved conflict after a conversation than maybe anything else, because it's so hard to get a handle on. Am I in the ballpark? That's kind of my takeaway.
I think you are. And another way to think about how that plays out is that although we just walked through the 3 layers of conversation, starting with what happened and then feelings and then identity, in fact, in practice, it goes the other way. Like identity gets hooked, which amplifies the feelings. Like we have bigger reactions than we otherwise would to what's going on and more anxiety. And then that also colors the story we tell, because we're going to cling more tightly to what we think we're right about because it feels safe in all this uncertainty and self-doubt or outrage. Like, I can't believe you're saying I was unfair. I'm like such a fair person. It also means that it's scary to think about my own contribution to the problem, the way in which I maybe am part of what happened. And it means we're more likely to attribute negative intentions to the other person.
Always, yep.
Yeah. So I think they're tied together. You said you were thinking of a couple of examples.
Well, in my world, I deal a lot with communicators and leaders. And those people who kind of identify and consider themselves really good communicators, that's part of an identity thing. So when I'm critiquing someone's communication and I know they identify, part of their identification is, hey, I'm a good communicator.
Yeah.
I've learned that if I can affirm that skill, their talent and their success before I dive into the how it could have gone better, again, I've affirmed something that's very, very important to them. Then I work with some extraordinary production people who just are like, they can just produce the heck out of things. Well, that's kind of their reputation in the organization. So again, everybody's carrying something that's kind of hey, my value add to this organization is A and B. And that has to be, at least organizationally, that's something they carry in terms of identity. So if I can remember to call that out early, affirm that, in other words, that's your value add here and you're so good at it. Now we got to talk about something that, is contentious. I think mentally or emotionally, it helps sort of separate the two to say, I'm not attacking the identity. We're talking about a separate thing. And then for me, it's the same thing, because as a communicator and leader, and I got this from reading the book. So I realized that my self-identity at work leans more toward, or I value my identity as a leader more than a communicator, I've discovered. So consequently, I get critiqued on my communication all the time. We do it between services every Sunday. And it's, nobody loves to get that stuff. But, I've learned to roll with it and I want to get better, and you don't get better without evaluation. But when people criticize my leadership, it's a deeper cut. So then taking that lesson and realizing, okay, what's true of me is true of everyone I'm face to face with when it comes to difficult conversations. So if I can affirm those things that I feel like, and in most cases, we're kind of guessing a little bit, that I feel like they might be building their identity around, it just goes better. Am I in the ballpark?
Oh, totally. What a fascinating thing to notice about yourself, which is that you have a bigger reaction when when they're talking about your leadership.
Absolutely.
And what does leadership mean to you? What do you hear them critiquing?
Well, I hear them critiquing my competency, right?
Competency in doing particular things?
Yeah,
or
in
being
terms
trusted?
Or just leadership in general,
Yeah.
But again, in recognizing that, I think I was able to turn that around and say, okay, what's true of me is true of everyone I'm face to face with, especially I'm the boss. So my words weigh 1,000 pounds anyway.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So anyway, I just thought the whole identity piece was, to me, that was the big aha in terms of these 3 levels. We all deal with what happened. The whole emotional thing, we know because we're emotional, but the identity piece
is at the heart of it.
Oh, yeah. There's a story that my wife's name is Sandra, and one of the stories that she tells is we just wrote a parenting book, and I told the story in the book, and I did the audible, and it's so emotional for me to tell this story. But she tells a story about she's holding our oldest. He was a baby. She's feeding him actually with like a spoon, just And her dad comes downstairs and sits there on the stool and just watches her, and he says to her, "You are such a great mother." And okay, everybody feeds their baby, right? I mean, this is not rocket science. I mean, bad mothers feed their children, but for her as a new mother who wants to get this right, this is a new part of her identity, she can hardly tell that story without it being emotional. Well, so I think we all have those things. And when we can discover those in each other, value those, again, I just think it creates extraordinary context for difficult conversations. And anyway, that was just another takeaway as I read this material. So thank you.
I love that story. And it also makes me think about the ways in which it's exactly when we're trying to grow into something that we're not sure we know how to do.
Ooh, yes.
Where we're most sensitive. And I mean, I so vividly remember being sent home from the hospital with our firstborn and feeling like this was an extremely irresponsible thing that the hospital was doing.
Even the way you said it, they sent us home.
Sent us home. I felt like this is not a responsible action for you to send this baby home with the 2 of us, because we do not know what we're doing. And in a work context, I think the 2 places where we're most sensitive are the places where we worry we don't know what we're doing, or we thought we did, and we suddenly find out that we're not as competent, we're not as far along. And I was curious about the particularities under that sense of leadership, because I've started to realize that the couple of things that really will grab me, hook me, and get me defensive have to do with if someone feels I wasn't fair, or if there's a question for them about whether they trust me in being honest with them. And those 2 things, I mean, I was once grounded for an entire summer because I lied to my mother. So being honest and trustworthy is a big deal in my identity story in terms of what I strive for. And like, that's the fastest way to get me on my back heel, right? Because I'm just like, what?
Yep. No, that's so important. And again, for our listeners, if we can identify that part of our own lives, number one, that's healthy. But then it creates the reminder, oh yeah, every person I'm face to face with is carrying an internal sense of identity that, and your illustration is so great, that oftentimes they don't even know what it is, but it is there.
Yes.
And I was doing a review with a communicator one time, and I was specific, but I wasn't harsh, but there were some things he needed to hear, and I saw him shut down. I mean, I just saw the lights go out, and I realized I should stop here. What 3 or 4 other men or women would take in stride, like, oh yeah, I need to work on that. I just touched on something that shut him down. And I did, I stopped it. We just kind of ended there. And it's that very thing. For you, it's honesty, and there's an integrity piece that's so important.
Yeah.
But it was a difficult conversation. And because obviously I was not dialed into the identity piece, I mean, lights went out. Again, we could go on and on.
We could, because this is exactly what led us from the work in difficult conversations to our next book 15 years later about the challenges of receiving feedback about ourselves from all the people around us. about the ways in which they wish we would change. And that journey to really hear and understand what the world is trying to tell us about how we're impacting them, I think is one of the most challenging, difficult conversations that we're having with ourselves, as well as with the people trying to get through to us. So I do think that this is part of what's at the heart of it for us and for anybody else we're in difficult conversations with.
Yep. Understanding that identity piece. And
Yeah.
And when you trip over it, there's suddenly it's like, wait, well, all I said was, but anyway, okay. So real quick, kind of a lightning round, and I can throw out these things and you can just comment on them as we wrap up. Just some of the most common mistakes in navigating a difficult conversation. Well, one of the things you talk about is postponing a difficult conversation. You want to comment on that? That's something we have all done, unfortunately. That does not make things better.
Yeah. So one of the things to do is to shift from blame to thinking about what did we each contribute to this. And avoiding a conversation until now is one of the most common things we contribute to the difficulty. We've let it sit. We've let it fester. People have come up with their own stories about what's really happening. And just owning that up front, like, I wish we would have had this conversation, a few weeks ago or maybe years ago, is a really powerful way to open a conversation.
So when we realize we have postponed it, just acknowledging that up front. Yep.
Looking back, I wish that I had reached out to you earlier. I think it's sat and festered, and I'm part of that.
Wow.
And I really apologize, but that's another reason I think it's so important for us to jump in and better understand it now.
There are, as you know, so many, our temperaments impact how prone we are to do these things on time or late or too early or come in with too much energy. Anyway, so I think each of us as leaders especially have to figure out where we are on that continuum and not postpone in an unhealthy way. The other thing you talked about, and you touched on this earlier, is the whole turning the conversation into a blame game, that it's easy to do that. And I think sometimes when we've postponed, we've built up too much steam and we come in with guns blazing, and next thing you know, it's just blame. How do we avoid that? Or how can we set ourselves up not to get into that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons. If you do not want to have a blaming conversation, then the strongest signal you can send is by owning your contribution up front. So whether that's, I shouldn't have postponed this, or it's, looking back, there are a number of things that I think I'm going to have to do differently going forward. And, for instance, here's at least one of them. But what I'd love to do is sit down and just better understand how we got here so that we can each know, what do we want to do differently going forward to either sort this out or to make sure that we don't land in the same place, next week, next month, or next year. And owning your contribution first is taking a little bit of a risk, because they might say like, oh, good, so it's all your fault.
Yeah.
But you don't have to accept that that's the last word. You can say,
right.
I can't change it by myself. I think we're probably both going to have to change.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's, I call that owning your slice of the blame pie. Sometimes I'll put a pie up, I'll say, okay, even if it's just 5%, you got to find your 5% and own it before you have the conversation. And generally it's more than 5%, but what's your slice of the pie? Another big one, and I have thoughts about this, I don't know if you'll agree, but another big problem you talk about is the lack of preparation or failing to prepare for a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
And I think most of us prepare for the difficult conversation in the car on the way to work. And that's all the prep we do, because we know the meeting's at 9:30 and now I'm going to prepare. And that is not a good approach. Talk a little bit about preparing for the difficult conversation.
Yeah. So one mistake is that we don't prepare. A second mistake is that we prepare by writing down or mentally noting our list of talking points. And the talking points tend to be things that we know we're right about, that we want to make sure to let them know, because, of course, once they understand, they will agree with us. It's the fantasy anyway. So instead, part of what I'm trying to do is actually move my own internal voice from what am I right about to, gosh, I wonder why we see it so differently. It seems so obvious to me that I'm right. What's causing them to have a different sense of things? What are their past experiences, et cetera? And if I can negotiate myself into a different purpose, which is first I have to understand why we see it so differently, then I'm apt to have a better conversation, thinking about what did we each contribute, including what do I want to own for myself. And the third thing on that drive in that I'm doing is reminding myself, I don't know their intentions, why they did what they did. I do know the impact that it's had on me or the team or the mission, and people we're trying to serve. So let me separate intent from impact and say, like, look, you probably didn't intend this. I don't know, but what I notice is an impact that I think we need to address. And that helps them preserve their identity, by the way. It's not saying you're a bad person and did it on purpose. It's just really focused on, let's talk about the impact, because that's the problem we need to solve.
I think, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in terms of preparation, this template that you lay out in the book is a great preparation template. It's, I need to be clear on what's happened. I need to think ahead, okay, what are the emotions this is going to elicit, and remember to affirm those emotions, just that's part of the preparation. And then this third piece, okay, because this is what we never think about intuitively, what do I perceive as their identity? And again, I'm guessing, but with a little bit of time, especially if it's somebody you work with, you can at least get close enough to, as part of my preparation, I want to make sure I affirm those things that I know they value about themselves. So I think the template just gives us a template for preparing, rather than, I know, to your point, I know what my talking points are, and we'll just let it go from there. So I think these three things are big part of the preparation, if we can remember. Yeah. Is that true, accurate?
That is true. So one of the things that we can do with this framework is to use it as a checklist.
Yep.
And once you get the hang of it, you can do it while you're driving into work. And, on our website, we have a section called Help Yourself, and we have free preparation, quick prep sheets that you can download, and just jot down your thoughts while you're getting ready for the Zoom call, right? Maybe don't jot down your thoughts while you're driving, but yes, you can make mental note while you're driving.
Well, I think the takeaway from the podcast, and I highly recommend the book, especially this new edition, because you keep updating illustrations and the things that are, because culture changes, the way we communicate change, the whole work from home thing makes this so complicated when you're not even around a person in the office much, and hey, we haven't seen each other in 2 months, and our next interaction is going to be negative. All of those things make this so much more complicated. Any final thoughts? I mean, there's obviously, we've skipped over so much, but any takeaways? Last thing, if you forget everything else, break the glass kind of thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think is useful to remind myself of is, gosh, to the extent that I have difficult conversations in my life, that's actually a sign of health in an organization. If you have difficult conversations and that you're anxious about and care about handling well, it tells me that you care about what you're doing, and you're really dedicated to doing it as well as you possibly can, including learning along the way. And the second thing it tells me is that you care a lot about the people you're doing it with.
Yep.
That disappointing them or frustrating them or being in conflict with them really matters to you. And those two things are beautiful things that we're both bought in. And over time, we're learning, can we trust each other that when we bump up against things, I know I just have confidence that we'll talk it through. And we'll figure out, gosh, what went wrong? Like, what should we learn together? And why'd you see it so differently? Where'd that come from? Fascinating. And if you're open to hearing what somebody else has to say, you make it much more likely that they are open to hearing what you have to say, and that you find your way together to the other side of an important conversation.
Wow. I think if we all think about the best boss we ever had, we will quickly remember there were some difficult conversations, right?
Yeah.
And their honesty, to the point you just made, their honesty and the fact that they would confront us, valued us in the organization. And here we are, however many years later, thinking back and going, but you know what? He really was the best boss. They developed me more than anybody else, and they developed me by confronting me and yet not taking away my dignity. Somehow they understood this identity piece. They affirmed my frustration, all those things. So for those of you who avoid difficult conversations, as you think about the people who have invested in you the most, there were difficult conversations along the way, so we need not shy away from these things. So
And I think that's what makes people trust their leaders.
Yep.
Is that they have a sense like, you're being straight with me. You're going to tell me the stuff, even if it's hard, but you're also going to be open
Yep.
to hearing my point of view so that I'm not in it alone.
Yep.
And not being in it alone, we're in it together,